Hello, my name is Patrick O'Donnell, and today I'll be presenting my final for College 100, instructed by Dr. Blanton. Thank you for listening. I chose my topic because I am currently enrolled in a degree program for emergency management with AMU. This specific thesis appealed to me for a few reasons. The first reason being that I am extremely fond of the science behind radioactivity. It is a topic that most individuals are unfamiliar with, and because of that, results in serious unease with the public. I also chose this thesis specifically, despite the limited job opportunities in this exact niche. Radiological threats are inevitable and pose serious hazards if not dealt with properly. My thesis is as follows. An emergency manager's roles and responsibilities in radiated and chemically exposed environments by exploring past shortfalls as well as main factors in planning for radiological or chemical disasters. In the most basic of descriptions, an emergency manager is a liaison between entities operating during a disaster. When there is no emergency present, an emergency manager takes steps to ensure that the community or organization is prepared by making plans, strengthening relationships, and tracking logistics of resources. I wanted to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of an emergency manager. Here I have two diagrams. On the first diagram in the left, we have planning, operations, logistics, and training. Planning is the bread and butter of the emergency manager, so to speak. Assessing local threats and hazards is a must and usually defined as a hazard analysis. After that is accomplished, one can begin to write and formulate plans to execute immediately after disaster strikes. Moving on to operations. Emergency managers can aid and support from indoors or in the field. An emergency operations center is typically stood up when a disaster strikes. In an EOC, all response parties have a chair so the disaster as a whole can be assessed and managed in a collective effort. Logistics. When disaster strikes, it is imperative that you have all your ducks in a row. Resource management allows you to confidently identify what tools are available to aid the relief effort. Radios for operational work, bulldozers for cleaning roads, or maybe sandbags for damming and flood control. Knowing what's available. Training or preparedness. A big aspect of preparedness is practice. Planning is useless if the community doesn't know how to respond. Making hazards aware to the public helps the community plan for the future. Knowledge is power when it comes to disaster safety. For the diagram on the right, we have preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. These are all steps that are taken by an emergency manager for any kind of recovery. Preparedness is being preemptive. Response, while the disaster is taking place, and recovery, helping out those in need after the disaster happens. Mitigation is essentially taking place during all of these steps. Now moving on to some of the research I've done, we're going to address past shortfalls that may have been avoided. First and foremost, with any kind of disaster, natural or man-made alike, it is important to weigh them with a certain sense of rationality. As Bolshov states, as concerns the lessons for nuclear power, before Chernobyl, the nuclear community thought that severe accidents cannot occur in our country. After the accident at Chernobyl, this attitude changed radically. The disbelief of a large-scale nuclear accident seemed impossible at the time purely because one had never been experienced. Identifying possible threats would undoubtedly be a great first step in preparing for them. A lot of actions can be taken to prepare, and one of the greatest is education for the masses. One other factor which we do not always recall when recounting the lessons from the accident of Chernobyl, and which appeared in full measure after the Fukushima accident, is the gap between the current world level of safety science that is provided by the scientific community in the event of severe accidents and what the personnel at the nuclear power plants face every day, states Bolshov. This quote hits hard by pressuring the scientific community to act in due diligence by informing the public not after the disaster strikes but before. That in turn puts pressure on the public to know the threats around them. Essentially, taking something like radioactivity seriously, especially when it could tumble out of control. When trying to find specific instances for these special types of disasters, it is not entirely hard. Due to the unique properties of radiation and chemical accidents, there are some major differences in procedure and response. Gehring states, a number of general consequences for nuclear emergency planning in the case of prolonged emissions becomes obvious. Here Gehring addresses the permanency of radioactive material itself in relation to sheltering after the disaster. Depending on the material, radiation can last a long time, unlike subsiding water from a flood or a tornado that can last for hours to minutes. Most families would not have the resources to wait out a typical radiation disaster, making evacuation mandatory for some. If people had been evacuated in the first days, this would have been in the direction south, against the prevailing winds during the time, posing a high risk, however, of high exposure for the evacuees only a few days later after the wind had changed, states Gehring. Almost immediately, another threat is identified for those trying to evacuate the contaminated areas. Due to fallout, which is particles traveling through the air, the individuals put themselves at risk if they relocate to a downwind area. Planning safe evacuation routes must be done in advance, in turn requiring downwind models to be quickly accessible. Turning this over to address the image on the right. Here we have the Fukushima plant, and located around it are the evacuation zones. An emergency manager would have to create the plans to safely and quickly evacuate individuals from the affected areas. Making sure that they go to the right areas is key. Another great reference for my project are the geological forces behind a volcano, mainly due to the similar plume aspects required for mapping radiological dispersal, as are volcanic gases and ash emitted during an eruption. Volcanic ash plumes will be persistent and largely unpredictable, so that cancellation or diverting of flights and temporary grounding of aircraft may happen more frequently than actual ash concentrations may require, states Jenkins. Once again, with contaminants aloft, evacuation is thwarted. Planes cannot fly with silica emissions in the air, and that poses a big problem for the individuals on the volcanic island of Nia Kameni. If long-term sheltering is not feasible due to a toxic atmosphere, and planes are not an option, then these problems need to be addressed. While proposing a cruise ship to haul off individuals may be a first thought, there are steps beyond that requiring thought and preparation for the victims of the disaster. It is apparent to me how much technology has played key roles in the advancement for disaster preparation and response. There are many forms of mapping software utilized today in an effort to steer clear of unwarranted injury or further suffering. Rhodos includes inter alia models for simulating atmospheric and aquatic dispersion, states Gehring. The program Rhodos was utilized in forming hazard mapping for nuclear facilities in Germany. I believe we have an obligation to provide the masses with a better level of security at this day and age. Just as I have addressed before, a large portion of this duty to be informed relies on the populace to know themselves. As Zakos addresses in his article, the major flood events in 2011 and early 2016 were warnings that a repeat in catastrophic floods of 1927 is possible, and without adequate planning, the loss of life and property would exceed the losses of 1927 by many times. While government aid is available, it is upon the individual to know what threats are around them. A simple question for the future homeowner might be, is the property located in a flood zone or flood basin. If you're purchasing a house in the Yazoo Basin, then your answer might be yes. Be an informed member for yourself and your community and know what threats lie around you. The image on the right is an example of the computer-based program that creates hazard areas for some of these nuclear facilities. It's a great tool. The image to the left is a foresight of what it would be like if the same Sumatra earthquake that caused the 2004 tsunami were to strike the Cascadia subduction zone off the U.S. West Coast. There is at least one nuclear power plant in the affected area to potentially receive structural damage indicated in yellow, and many more in the gray area to even feel the ground move. What potentials does Chernobyl or Fukushima incident have of being in our own backyard? In conclusion, I came to 3 roles and responsibilities specific for planning of radiological or chemical disasters. 1 is assessment, assessing the maximum capacity a threat may achieve given the specific isotope or chemical and planning for it. 2, technology, use the latest mapping and imaging software to preemptively foreshadow the extent of the possible threat. And 3, education. The masses need to be well informed on the threats around them and the processes that will happen when disaster strikes. I would like to thank everybody for listening today. I've added a short clip at the very end of this for those that are interested in learning a little bit more about what an emergency manager does and what it takes. Thank you.
I think emergency management is about relationship building. Emergency management creates the framework that we use to reduce our community's vulnerability to a hazard and to cope with a disaster after it happens.
Anytime a local agency, a local entity, or even a state agency has to respond to an event that they can't manage the event with their resources, then that's when you get emergency management involved, whether it's your local emergency manager or the state emergency manager. Both of us have enabling legislation or ordinances that allows us to tap into all the resources that a county has or the state has. We're merely facilitators and enablers. It's our job to make sure that that local incident commander or the state person in charge of whatever event they're managing is successful.
Emergency management to me is basically a spirit of cooperation between agencies within a county. If you will, picture a wheel, and emergency management, as far as emergency response being the hub of that wheel and the other agencies being the spokes. We coordinate the activities, we respond to the other agencies and help them provide the necessary services they need within their county and help get the resources they need to perform those services.
Emergency management would be the one department within each county that acts as the coordination for all of the other emergency services. Participates in a large amount of planning, overall training and exercise activities for the county to coordinate and ensure that all of those agencies are working together prior to and then when the wind begins to blow and the waters begin to rise.
I see it as teamwork, a group of emergency responders working together to ensure the safety of the citizens within my county. I do not believe that one person can do that. You just have to develop relationships within all emergency response agencies, as well as the public and private partnerships that you have to develop.
Emergency management is a coordination of all agencies that come together to protect the public. We serve all disciplines, whether it be fire, EMS, law enforcement, agriculture, recovery, Red Cross.
What we do is to manage that span of control with those resource requests coming into the state level is we have regional coordination centers. These centers are pre-established, three geographically across our state. The biggest thing is we're trying to get resources, people, commodities, get the speed to the need. We never want to be late with delivering services, resources, swiftwater teams, our urban search and rescue teams. We won't be able to pre-deploy those, have those out in those regional coordination centers under their direction and control that they can immediately get the resources out when we need them.
We do say all, and you'll hear this anywhere you go in the nation, is all disasters begin and end locally. So in emergency management, as I mentioned, we don't have the resources, but we have established strong partnerships with other state agencies, with counties, with the federal government, so that we can very rapidly get resources downrange in what I call the battlefield and the disaster operation very, very quickly. And so that's the key, I think, to our success, is the interpersonal relationships that we strive to maintain each and every day.
I think the biggest thing is just a spirit of partnership and cooperation. None of the counties, none of the municipalities in the state are as autonomous as they would like to be. They depend on one another. The state of North Carolina depends on us, we depend on them. So it's cooperation and coordination between us that allows us to do what we do within the state.